Black psychology, if I look at it and I look at its history and the important individuals who have contributed to it, they were the first of the social scientists, I think, who sort of really understood what it was to investigate and interrogate African culture in order to try to find some kind of continuity and link to this whole notion of correcting and also advancing the African narrative in America.
Black psychology is looking at the perceptions, values, worldview from the perspective of black folks as they articulate it. So that we didn't discover black psychology in the 60s, it was already there, but we articulated it from the perspective of the folks themselves. We wanted to give them their own voice. Whereas prior to that time, that voice was invisible in psychology, or it was deficit deficiency, low IQ, poor impulse control, can't delay gratification, can't do a complex task. So the story had been told from outside, and we wanted to tell it from inside out.
Black psychology is part of what we would call the Black Studies movement. The Black Studies movement is a movement to essentially capture the experience of a particular people, in this case people of African descent. It's, in terms of psychology, it's an attempt to be that strand of Black studies that focuses on the psychology of a people, in this case people of African descent. It is a movement that's part reactionary, part proactive. Reactionary in the sense that mainstream psychology and mainstream cultural studies either did not pay much attention to the black experience, or even worse, tended to scaffold it in pejorative terminology and results. So it's both a correction, but it's also an affirmation. It's no accident that it eventually evolved into something called African psychology, because some of the people who are concerned with the study of black people are also concerned with going back in time and space and seeing the connection to our ultimate roots.
African psychology represents a kind of like an evolution of black psychology that began as a black psychology. Now, black psychology, I think of as having begun in reaction to what we had learned about identifying who we were. And when I say what we had learned as captives within a Euro-American, a European frame of reference, a European definition of what was reality, what was real, and what it meant to be human. And so our introduction to psychology then was reacting to that. So we had to kind of deconstruct that. And that deconstruction says, okay, we must no longer see ourselves as we were defined by this other perspective, which is not our own perspective, and therefore we need to identify it as a perspective that in fact identifies who we are. And so at the level of a kind of political confrontation, it became kind of black psychology. So it became a kind of a liberation tool. How do we kind of free the captives from this alien perspective of defining themselves?
Black psychology, it's a spectrum. On one side of the spectrum is Africa. And then a writer has to decide how deep he wants to go into the foundation of Africa to understand these brothers in Oakland today. And some go all the way back to ancient Egypt, and some pick it up more when we come here to the States. But it's all part of one model, I'd say, that has different variations.
My black psychology also has a cultural component, because it's only from the cultural grounding of what I call the wisdom tradition of African deep thought that conception of black makes sense. So African psychology would be inclusive of black psychology based on my definition, but African psychology, I think in most people's mind's eye, again speaks to a particular cultural orientation, of which my definition could be a part.
Black psychology within that vein generally refers to psychology related to the African American experience in some camps of the black psychology community. And African American psychology, of course, would be used interchangeably with that usage of black psychology. And of course, African psychology, the way I use it, has a global scope, in terms of ethnicity and racial application.
The further you go back into the African experience or the African ethos, the more you are trying to find a source of original strengths and values that did not emanate from the American experience. So while the American experience is long, it's rich, it has its strengths, but the original values and foundations of people of African descent who live in America came from Africa.
In my work, I actually use I combine the terms black and African, or I link them. So I use African/black psychology to indicate that I'm not only referring to the psychological experience of African Americans or the psychological experience of North Americans, but the psychological experience of diasporian Africans as well as continental Africans, understanding that there may be some contextual variation and even some philosophical variation because of the context, but at the core that the worldview principles would be relatively the same, across the geographic and national boundaries.
As we move from kind of deconstructing that paradigm or deconstructing those assumptions to begin to reconstruct how it was we defined ourselves before our captivity, I think the way that we identified that reconstruction process was to call it African psychology. So I don't like to think of it as being antithetical. I simply see it as being the evolution. It's the older brother, the older sister. It's a more matured perspective of what began as a kind of a reactive form that came to be a kind of a reconstructing of defining ourselves for ourselves from our own ontological perspective.
To me, African psychology was about essentially a cultural war. And what I write about, in fact, in some of my latest work is that a cultural war is literally an ideological struggle where we are literally at war for the minds and hearts and the future of our people. And so the development of the discipline of African psychology really became a cultural war of ideology. It became a cultural war of self-determination, in where we as African psychologists determined to chart our own future rather than just following the footsteps of our colleagues in European American psychology. It was a cultural war of values, and that were the values that are central to African psychology going to read the footsteps that we followed, as opposed to embracing someone else's cultural ideology in European and Western psychology. And it was also a war of cultural relevance. To me, African psychology was fundamentally about cultural relevance and whether or not we could develop a psychology that was relevant to the people. And that, to me, is what was important. And even as we have come to then reclaim and transform black psychology to more of an African psychological base.
What makes Africa so essential to our understanding of humanity is the fact that that's the only place that we can find the historical foundation for all human culture and civilization. So if we're going to be comprehensive in our orientation, we absolutely have to go back to Africa. And if we make that our cultural frame, what does that tell us?
Afrocentricity is a theory that gives African people the conceptual framework from which to discuss and analyze and to critique almost all of phenomena related to African people.
African psychology begins to build on some of the basic assumptions about the nature of life, the nature of the human being, that is, in fact, indigenous to African people categorically, not a particular country from Africa, but when you talk about the genesis of humanity and the genesis of understanding what human beings are all about.
I would define African psychology as a system of knowledge encompassing constructs, concepts, paradigms, models, systems of practice, procedures for conduct, etc., a way of knowing the world in reality from the perspective or the vantage point or grounded in African American culture reality and African culture reality.
African psychology is basically a perspective that looks at human beings within the context of how Africans understood the human experience and begins to build on some of the basic assumptions about the nature of life, the nature of the human being, that is, in fact, indigenous to African people categorically.
To discuss the mind of the African person, even in the Americas, you have to at least have some appreciation for how this has emerged and developed in the African experiences over thousands of years.
The African psychology is the only psychology, that the first attempt by human beings to understand the spirit and human functioning was done in ancient Kemet, or what people call Egypt.
I like to traverse our landscape all the way back into ancient Kemet, and to know that for me, African psychology first began when human beings decided to stand up and recognize the authenticity of their humanness. And as we go back and then reclaim some of that African culture and begin to study and embrace some of the ideology that came out of those ancient Kemetic and historically African places, what we know is that our discipline of psychology is really thousands of years old, not just 20, 30, 40, 50, or even 100 years old, and in fact traverses a landscape from historical contemporary times all the way back even into ancient Kemetic spaces.
And later on, way later on, some several thousand years later, Europeans began to talk about a psychology, and which really was an armchair philosophy that later on became, with Wundt, became based on laboratory, and it became, quote, scientific psychology. But all that is very recent. The original psychology was in ancient Egypt or ancient Kemet by black people.
The term psychology was in fact a derivation of psyche, which was in fact a recognition that the psyche was the soul, and that the study of the soul was the original agenda of what the discipline of psychology was all about.
If you look at psychology, and we say black psychology, some people say Saku. When we look at these concepts, when we go backwards in terms of our history to sort of find a standing place, what we discover is that the African people had already developed many notions of the mind long before we encountered the West. So my work and the work of black psychologists, I think too, in a similar way and perhaps in a much more specific way, is to find out or to discover what are those bases. And we come up, therefore, with notions from the Nile Valley civilizations where we can say, well, before the Greeks came to these notions of the mind, particularly concepts that they came out with like logos and pathos and ethos and so forth, that Africa had at its root notions such as Mat, for example, Sarujta, I mean, many notions that were very basic, and if we could grapple with those notions and understand those notions, we will have some understanding.
In fact, there is a huge a scene in the pyramids. It's called the psychostasis. And the psychostasis is that scene that some of you know about, where you have the initiate being judged by the netters or by the gods, and the weighing of his heart against the feather of Ma'at. That is an ancient scene. It's called the psychostasis. And in that scene, the interpretation of it is that man or woman must go through a judgment of their righteousness. And when they are found wanting, they have to be taught the right way. And the right way is what we call therapy. Teaching the right way is what later the Europeans call therapy.
The pyramids were actually designed by priests. They were designed by people whose study was of the soul. This psychology, the study of the soul, the study of the spirit. Because what they understood, that this whole premise for human development and evolution had to do with the idea of self-consciousness, knowing who you were. And the self-consciousness meant that your ultimate identity was that of being a spiritual entity.
But in my own work, I have made the argument that scene was called the saku. And the saku is really the word that was bastardized by the Greeks to become the psyche. And the psyche becomes the study of the spirit, or psychology, but it really was saku, which was the illumination of the spirit. And in illuminating the human spirit, one was able to understand the transitions and the transformations of humanity.
And so in African psychology, what we have tried to do is go back across space and time. Space meaning what is central to North Africa, Central, South, West, and East Africa. Across time, meaning what is consistent in ancient Kemetic, historically African, and contemporary African American spaces, that allow us as black psychologists to go back and reclaim some of those traditions and customs and worldviews that are part and parcel of our own cultural traditions. And that, to me, is where African psychology has evolved and what it represents today as a series of constructs and principles that are more consistent with an African-centered ideology.
Well, there are different African wisdom traditions that speak to what we're now seeing as African psychology.
Human beings are primarily spiritual beings. That is a fundamental tenet that goes all the way back to Nile Valley civilization, and it is consistent through every culture of Africa.
And that fundamental core concept is spirit. And in fact, it is an assessment of the meaning of being human.
The way that Africans understand psychological development is a process of transformation, where you become gradually transformed so that you can become an affirmation of that spiritual being that you came here to be. So the idea is that we are in a journey, and the life experience, the physical life experience, is in fact a transition. And it's a period of transformation from spirit back to spirit.
What is real is my spirit. And that spirit is a knowing and knowable, trifold, vibrating, radiating spirit. And so part of what we are now talking about as psychology is knowing what our spirit knows. Being able to talk to our spirit, being able to understand where that vibrating, radiating energy that we call spirit becomes chaotic. When I get disconnected or shattered, then I see chaotic rhythm. And that chaotic rhythm is best what we call insanity. There is a cultural linguistic family, and that cultural linguistic family is called the Bantu Congo. And within that Bantu Congo are the Yoruba, are the Zulu, are the Akan, are the Fulani, etc. So I want to look at the Bantu Congo because that's, to me, looks like an overarching commonality. And some of that has to do with across time. Because you can go to the Kemetic system, which now you're talking about, 3,000-4,000 BC. And the structures with the Kemites did was they had a very elaborate explication of the human spirit. of the Ka, the Ba, the Kaba, all those aspects of the spirit. What's I think going to happen is that as we black psychologists begin to embrace this idea of an African psychology, different ones of us will radiate to the different linguistic or cultural systems.
I don't think we should ever lose sight of the kind of historical sequence of that, this whole evolutionary process, that you really needed, like the black psychology. We had to react to the captivity. You couldn't get free until you knew you were a slave. And it's the same thing in terms of thinking about psychology. So certainly I think African psychology is a reclamation of the way that we define the nature of being human and what the human processes are all about.
I think one of the things that's going to be our primary challenge is trying to figure out how do we make African-centered theoretical frameworks and conceptual principles relevant in the type of psychological science, or research that we do. I think with individuals like a Kobe Kambon or Naeem Akbar and Asa Hilliard, that they were very good at laying out theoretical concepts and framework. But what hasn't happened is that they haven't passed the baton to people who are going to advance their work, right? They've passed the baton to people who can repeat and regurgitate their work, but not those who can advance their work. I'm not sure of what it would take in order to advance that work, but that's a problem that we really have to find a solution for, and find a solution very quickly.